She had rebuilt her life from nothing, flour, butter, and sheer stubbornness, only to watch a room full of people she'd fed for years vote to take it all away. Evelyn Mercer stood behind her own counter while Victor Blackridge spread his papers across her mother's table, and the whole town of Frost Hollow nodded along like it had already been decided. Nobody noticed the man in the back of the room, the one who'd been coming here every 2 weeks for 6 years, who'd never once asked her to be anything other than exactly who she was. But they were about to. If you've ever had to fight to stay yourself in a world that keeps telling you to change, this story is for you. Watch until the end, hit that like button, and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. The first snow of October came to Frost Hollow the way it always did, without warning and without apology. It rolled down from the Bitterroot Peak sometime before 3 in the morning, and by the time Evelyn Mercer was pulling her first batch of cinnamon rolls from the oven at 4:15, there was already an inch of white on the windowsill outside. She didn't need to look at a calendar to know the season had changed. She could feel it in the way the cold pressed through the gaps in the old building's walls, seeking her out the way cold always found the places where warmth was trying hardest to hold on. The bakery had no proper name above the door. There had been a sign once, painted by her mother in the summer of 1987, Mercer's in dark green letters on a yellow background. But the wood had rotted and fallen during a windstorm 3 years back, and Evelyn hadn't replaced it. There didn't seem to be a point. Everybody in Frost Hollow knew where the bakery was. They'd been finding it their whole lives. She worked in the dark for the first hour every morning, the way she'd learned from her mother, and her mother had learned from hers. The overhead light in the back kitchen had a flicker to it that irritated her eyes before sunrise, so she did the early work by the glow of the oven and the single lamp on the shelf above the work table. It made the space feel smaller than it was, warmer than it should have been in October. She liked that. The sourdough starter sat in its ceramic crock on the second shelf, something she'd been feeding every day for 11 years. Her mother had kept the original going for 32 years before her hands got too bad to work the dough. And before she'd passed the crock to Evelyn, she'd said, "Don't ever let it die. It's older than most of the people in this town, and it deserves more respect than most of them get anyway." Evelyn had kept that promise. Some mornings it was the first thing she checked. Before coffee, before anything. She was 38 years old, and she had lived in Frost Hollow her entire life, except for 4 years in Boise that she tried not to think about too carefully. Her marriage to Dale Mercer had lasted 6 years on paper, and about 4 of those in any meaningful way. He had been handsome in the way that sometimes causes problems, the kind of handsome that gets treated well enough by the world that a man never really has to develop much underneath it. He'd told her she was beautiful in the beginning when everything was beginning, and she'd believed him because she was 24 and had never had much practice at not believing the things she wanted to be true. By the end, he was making comments about her weight at the dinner table, and she would sit there and eat less than she wanted and feel the particular shame of being hungry in her own house. She'd come back to Frost Hollow 6 years ago with 2 suitcases and the ceramic crock wrapped in her winter coat and not much else. Her mother had been sick by then, and the bakery had been struggling along without anyone to really run it, and Evelyn had simply taken both things on at once because that was what needed doing. She didn't talk about Dale much. Occasionally someone in town would bring him up. "Whatever happened to that husband of yours?" And she'd give a short answer and change the subject and afterwards stand in the back kitchen for a few minutes, feeling the old dull ache settle through her chest before she shook it off and went back to work. The town had not been particularly kind to her about her weight. That was simply the truth of it, and she'd long since stopped pretending otherwise. Frost Hollow had maybe 300 residents depending on the season, and like most small places, it had very strong opinions about how people within it ought to look and behave. Evelyn was a large woman, had been most of her adult life, and the town had a way of reminding her of this that was sometimes direct and sometimes worse, the kind of sideways reminders that came wrapped in concern, in helpful suggestions, in the particular brand of cruelty that gets to call itself kindness. Clara Hitchens, who ran the dry goods store 2 blocks down, had a habit of saying things like, "Oh, Evelyn, you'd be so pretty if you just," and then filling in the blank with whatever had occurred to her that day. Evelyn had heard the end of that sentence so many times she could have finished it herself. She never did. She just smiled and said something pleasant and went on with her day, because that was the other thing she'd learned from her mother. Don't let them see where it lands. But it landed. It always landed somewhere. She was not, by any reasonable measure, a woman who felt sorry for herself. The bakery opened at 6:30 Monday through Saturday, and she was there every one of those mornings, and the breads and pastries she produced were the kind that made people quiet for a moment after the first bite. Not from politeness, but from something genuine, some involuntary acknowledgement that they were tasting something that had been made with actual care. She used her mother's recipes and her mother's techniques, and in some cases her mother's exact handwritten notes, brown at the edges now, tacked to the inside of the cabinet above the flour bin. Honey wheat bread on Mondays and Thursdays. A dark rye on Tuesdays that Hector Malm from the feed store bought an entire loaf of every single week without fail. Cinnamon rolls on Wednesdays and Saturdays that had, over the years, become something close to a local institution. Apple turnovers in the fall. A shortbread at Christmas that people placed orders for in September because they'd learned the hard way that showing up and hoping for one was a fool's errand. The town needed the bakery more than most of its residents would have admitted. There was no grocery store in Frost Hollow. The nearest one was 40 minutes south on a road that turned genuinely dangerous in February. And what the bakery provided wasn't just bread. Evelyn kept an informal tab for 3 or 4 families who went through rough patches, and she never put a dollar amount on the tab, and she never brought it up unless they did. When old Pete Carver had a bad winter a couple of years back, and his truck broke down and his knee was giving him trouble and he couldn't get out to work, Evelyn had started leaving a bag of groceries on his porch twice a week. She didn't tell anyone she was doing it, and she didn't expect thanks. It just needed doing. That was how she operated, quietly, practically, with her head down and her hands in the dough. She did not have many close friends in Frost Hollow. There was Ruth Halley, who taught at the elementary school and came in every Friday morning for coffee and a cinnamon roll and stayed for an hour to talk about whatever had happened that week. There was Nora Sims, who was 71 and sharp as new wire and had known Evelyn's mother, who came in on Tuesday afternoons and sat in the chair by the window and read her library book and occasionally offered opinions about the town that were so precisely accurate they made Evelyn laugh despite herself. Beyond that, her social life was the bakery itself, the parade of people who came through her door every morning, who she knew, by order and habit, and the particular things they said when they thought they were making conversation. She knew that Hector Malm's wife had left him years ago, and he never mentioned her. She knew that the Dawson kids came in on Saturdays because their mother was working a double at the diner across town, and they'd have been alone otherwise. She knew which of the older men came in, not because they needed bread, but because they needed to be somewhere that felt warm and familiar for 20 minutes. She knew all of this, and she filed it away, and she never made it awkward. That was the gift. What she did not know, or what she told herself she didn't know, which was not quite the same thing, was that there was a man who had been coming into her bakery every 2 weeks for 6 years, and that his reasons for coming had almost nothing to do with bread. Intime. His name was Gideon Ashcroft, and he was the kind of man that Frost Hollow had strong feelings about without actually knowing very much about him. He was tall enough that he had to angle his shoulders slightly to come through most doorways, with the kind of build that came not from a gym but from years of actual physical work in difficult terrain. He had a beard that he kept roughly trimmed and dark hair that he cut himself, judging by the results. And he wore the same kind of clothes in every season: canvas pants, wool shirts, heavy boots that tracked the wilderness in behind him. His hands were large and permanently roughened, the knuckles scarred in the way of a man who worked with them constantly and had stopped noticing the damage. He ran a trap line in the Bitterroot Range, had been doing it for close to 15 years. He had a cabin up near the timberline that he'd built himself, largely from materials he'd sourced and shaped himself, and he came down to Frost Hollow every 2 weeks or so to sell hides at Hadley's trading post, pick up supplies, and though he'd never said this to anyone, stop at the bakery. The town had decided that Gideon Ashcroft was strange. That was the word most commonly used. Strange. Too quiet. Too solitary. Too much of the mountain about him, as though he'd been up there long enough that civilization had started to feel foreign on his skin. Children found him alarming when he first walked past, and then got used to him and eventually ignored him, which was roughly the arc most people followed. He never started conversations. He answered questions in the shortest available number of words. He did not attend town events or church or the informal gatherings at the Red Pine Tavern on Friday nights that functioned as Frost Hollow's version of a social life. He bought what he needed, sold what he had, and went back up the mountain, and for most of the town that was sufficient information to have about a person. Nobody, as far as Evelyn was aware, had ever really talked to him. She had. Or at least she'd tried, in the early days, the way she tried with everyone who came through the door. She had a default warmth with customers that was not performed. She was genuinely interested in people, genuinely glad to see them, and it came through in the way she asked after their week and remembered the details they'd mentioned last time and the time before. With most people, this practice was returned in kind. With Gideon Ashcroft, it had produced, over 6 years, a collection of short answers and the occasional almost smile, and the reliable observation that he always ordered the same thing: honey wheat, 1 loaf, 2 cinnamon rolls if it was a Wednesday. He would lay the exact money on the counter. She'd noticed he always had it ready, didn't dig for it. And he'd take the bag and he'd say thank you, and that was usually the end of it, except that sometimes it wasn't quite the end. There had been mornings, particularly in winter when the bakery was quiet, when he'd stood at the counter for a moment after taking his bag, and she'd had the distinct impression that there was something else he'd meant to say. She'd wait a beat, and then the moment would pass, and he'd nod slightly. That particular nod, chin dropping a half-inch, which was his version of a farewell. And he'd be gone. She'd stopped thinking about it much. He was a private man. There was no reason his silences needed to mean anything. One morning, in early November, 2 years ago, she had been in the back kitchen when she heard the front door and came out to find Gideon standing at the counter, and also directly behind him in the narrow space between the shelves, Clara Hitchens, who had apparently come in at the same moment and was now loudly not looking at him in the way that signaled she was extremely aware of his presence. Evelyn had come to the counter and said, "Good morning, Gideon," and started pulling his usual order before he asked for it, which she'd been doing for 2 years by then, and he'd watched her do it with an expression she couldn't read. "Cold coming," he said. "So I heard. Are you heading back up today?" "Tomorrow. You want an extra loaf? I've got a dark rye that came out well this morning." He'd looked at her for a moment. Actually looked at her, which he didn't always do, which most people didn't do when they were talking to her, she'd noticed, and said, "Yeah, all right." Behind him, Clara Hitchens had been making a very small noise in her throat, and Evelyn knew without looking that she was taking in the size of Evelyn's forearms as she wrapped the second loaf and forming an opinion about them. When Gideon had gone, Clara had leaned on the counter and said, "How do you manage to talk to him like that? He makes my skin crawl, honestly. There's something not right about a man who lives up a mountain by himself." Evelyn had said, "He's quiet. That's not the same thing. He looks at you like he's figuring something out." "Clara, can I help you with something today?" She'd thought about that afterward, though. "He looks at you like he's figuring something out." She hadn't known quite what to do with that observation, so she'd filed it in the category of things she didn't examine too carefully and moved on. Putin. The trouble with Victor Blackridge began, as many kinds of trouble do, with someone being extraordinarily friendly. He came into Frost Hollow on a Wednesday in late October, driving a truck that cost more than most residents earned in 2 years. And he spent that first day walking the main street with his hands in his coat pockets and looking at everything with the assessing expression of a man running a calculation. He ate dinner at the only diner in town, tipped extremely well, and asked the waitress questions about the community with what appeared to be genuine interest. He came into Evelyn's bakery the following morning at 7:30, right in the middle of the rush, which in Frost Hollow meant 5 or 6 people at once, but it was still the busiest part of the day. He stood in line, he waited, he ordered a coffee and one of the apple turnovers she had on the rack, and he sat down at the small table by the window and ate it slowly with the expression of someone tasting something they hadn't expected. When the rush cleared and Evelyn was wiping down the counter, he brought his cup up and said, "That was the best pastry I've had in 3 years, and I've had pastry in San Francisco." "The apples are local," she said, "from a farm about 12 miles east. Makes a difference. I imagine it does." He set the cup down. "I'm Victor Blackridge. I've been looking at this town for about 6 months, thinking about what it needs." She looked at him then. He was maybe 50, well kept, with the kind of easy confidence that came from a life in which things generally worked out. He had good teeth and an expensive haircut, and the manner of someone who'd learned to seem approachable because it was useful. "And what does it need?" she asked. "Honestly?" "Investment, vision, someone willing to bet on it." He looked around the bakery. At the mismatched chairs, the hand-lettered menu board, the ancient glass case with its paper labels. This place is a gem. You know that. You've been keeping this town fed almost single-handedly from what I can tell. It's a bakery, she said. It's not that dramatic. You're underselling it. He smiled. I'd like to have a proper conversation with you, Miss Mercer, when you have time, about what this place could become. She hadn't said yes exactly. She'd said she was open to hearing what he had in mind, which wasn't the same thing, but she could tell by the way he nodded that he'd taken it as a yes. She should have noticed that then. She didn't. The week after Victor Blackridge arrived was the week that Frost Hollow decided to have an opinion about Evelyn's future. It was Clara Hitchens who started it, which was not surprising. Clara was the town's primary mechanism for the transmission of information that wasn't quite information yet, an opinion that hadn't been asked for. She had the kind of energy that needed constant expression, and the expression most natural to her was commentary on other people's situations. She came into the bakery on Thursday morning with her friend Patrice Wells, who ran the post office and generally agreed with whatever Clara said because it was less work. And they stood at the counter while Evelyn poured their coffees, and Clara said, "Have you spoken to that developer yet? The one staying at the Pines?" "I met him," Evelyn said. "He's talking about real money from what I hear." "Real money, Evelyn. Do you know what that could do for this place?" "I don't know what he's proposing yet. Whatever it is, I think you ought to hear him out. Seriously, hear him out." Clara picked up her coffee and looked at Evelyn with the particular expression she used when she was about to say something she'd framed as concern. "You've been running this place on the edge for years. I know you don't like to admit it, but people talk, and a chance like this doesn't come twice in a town like Frost Hollow. I'll hear what he has to say." "Good. Because—" Clara paused, glanced at Patrice in a way that meant she'd already said this to Patrice and was now going to say it to Evelyn. "He's going to want to modernize things, the whole look, the branding, and you know what that probably means." Evelyn set down the coffee pot. "What does it mean, Clara? It means you'd need to present yourself differently. That's all I'm saying. For something like this to work, the image has to be, consistent. Consistent with what?" Clara made a small gesture that managed to encompass Evelyn's entire person. The flour-dusted apron, the hair pulled back practical and fast, and the body wearing all of it, which was a size 18 and had been for several years. With the kind of thing people want to buy into. That's just business. There was a pause. Evelyn could feel it in the room. The held breath, the way Patrice was studying a point slightly to the left of the cinnamon roll display. "Thank you, Clara," Evelyn said, and her voice was level in the way it got when she was working hard to keep it that way. "Let me get you your change." After they left, she stood in the back kitchen for 4 minutes with her hands flat on the work table and the familiar ache moving through her chest, and then she went back out front because there was a line forming at the door. She met with Victor Blackridge that evening at the diner because she didn't want him in the bakery for this part of it. She wanted to be able to leave. He had a folder of documents and a laptop and the easy, practiced energy of a man who did this regularly. He talked about branding and market positioning and the emerging interest in what he called artisan regional products with the enthusiasm of someone who'd memorized a successful pitch. She listened. She was good at listening. The money he described was real. She knew enough about her own finances to understand that. The bakery was not failing. She'd never let it fail. But it was operating on margins thin enough that one bad winter, one equipment breakdown, one stretch of bad luck could change everything. She'd been one bad thing away from serious trouble for 3 years running, and she knew it, and she'd never said it to anyone except Ruth, once, late on a Friday night after the bakery had closed. "What I need from you," Victor said, settling back in his chair, "is the recipes, the name, and your involvement in the launch phase. After that, we'd transition to a managed operation, standardized suppliers." "My mother's recipes?" "They'd be part of the brand, yes. We'd test them in the larger markets, refine them based on... refine them." He paused. "Adjust them. To scale. They're not designed to scale, they're designed to taste like something." He smiled with his mouth. "That's exactly the authentic quality we'd be selling. We'd preserve the essence." "What's the other part?" she asked. "You said you needed the recipes, the name, and my involvement. What does my involvement mean, specifically?" He opened the folder and produced a page that had the word brand ambassador at the top. She read it carefully. He waited with the patience of someone who'd learned that waiting made the numbers look better. The terms were detailed about two things: what she could no longer put in her product line and how she was expected to present herself at events and in marketing materials. The second section used phrases like reflects the brand's aesthetic vision and aligns with consumer expectations for the premium market segment. This section, she said, about presentation, standard contract language for brand-facing roles. What does it mean? He met her eyes, and for the first time since she'd sat down, the easy confidence shifted into something that was trying to look like honesty. It means you'd work with our team on styling, wardrobe, presentation, for the marketing assets, and my appearance. Evelyn, I want you to say it directly. He put his hands on the table, a gesture she recognized as practiced. The premium artisan market has a specific visual language. Our research is very clear on what moves product at that price point. It's not personal, it's market positioning. You want me to lose weight, we'd offer full support. A nutritionist, a fitness consultant. I'm going to stop you there, she said, and pushed the folder back across the table. Thank you for your time. Evelyn, the financial package alone. I heard the financial package. She stood up. Her coat was on the back of her chair and she picked it up without making a production of it. And I understand what you're offering. I want you to understand what you're asking for. She drove home through the October dark with the heater on and her hands steady on the wheel, and the number he'd quoted sitting somewhere at the back of her mind like a stone she hadn't decided what to do with yet. She sat in her car in front of the bakery for a while before she went in. The lights were off in the front of the building. Through the side window, she could see the blue-gray glow of the oven pilot light. She didn't cry. She'd done her crying about this kind of thing years ago, during the Dale years, when the comments at the dinner table had been constant and calibrated and she'd had no place to put them except inside herself. She'd learned to process this kind of thing efficiently, without drama, the way she processed most things. Take it in. Let it sit. Decide what it actually means. Move forward. What it meant was that the choice being offered to her was not really a choice between accepting and refusing a business deal. It was a choice between the version of herself she'd rebuilt carefully over 6 years and the version that the world, Victor Blackridge, Clara Hitchens, Dale Mercer, all the voices that had been telling her to be different for as long as she could remember, wanted instead. She already knew what she believed the answer was. She was not yet sure she was brave enough to act on it. The next morning, she opened the bakery at 6:30 as usual, and at 7:45, right when the first rush was thinning, the front door opened and Gideon Ashcroft came in. He was a week early. He was never early. She looked up from the register, and he was standing just inside the door with the cold coming in around him, and something in his expression, or the thing his expression did when it almost became one, made her pause. "You're early," she said. "Yeah." He came to the counter. He had his hands in the pockets of his canvas coat, which meant he hadn't gotten the money ready in advance, which also wasn't like him. "I was coming down anyway." "Supplies." She waited. "Honey wheat," he said. She turned to get it and she heard him behind her, not moving, and she turned back and he was looking at her with that look Clara Hitchens had described, like he was figuring something out. Except she understood now that the figuring out had already been done a long time ago. Whatever this expression was, it wasn't calculation. It was something else, something that had been there a long time without her knowing it, and she was only seeing it now because something had changed in the angle of light, or in her. "Gideon," she said. "I heard he's making you an offer," he said. "Blackridge." The town being what it was, this was not surprising. "News travels," she said. "Are you going to take it?" She set the loaf on the counter. He didn't reach for it. "I don't know," she said, which was the most honest she'd been with anyone about it. He nodded, the chin drop, the almost nod, and he picked up the bread and he set the money on the counter, which as always was the exact right amount, and he turned to go. At the door he stopped. Didn't turn around completely. Just enough. "For what it's worth," he said, and then seemed to reconsider, and then said it anyway. "This place is the best thing in this town. What you make here. The way you—" He stopped again. "The way you do it," he finished, and then he was gone, the cold coming in one last time, and then the door closing and the warmth of the bakery settling back around her. She stood at the counter for a moment looking at the space where he'd been. Then Ruth Halley came through the door, cold-cheeked and unwinding her scarf, and said, "Was that Gideon Ashcroft? What did he want?" "Bread," Evelyn said. Ruth dropped into her usual chair. "You okay? You look like someone told you something." "I'm fine." She poured the coffee. The smell of the morning's baking filled the room around them, yeast and cinnamon and the specific warmth that the old oven threw. And outside, the first real snow of the season was beginning to fall. "Someone told me something," she said. "What did they say?" She set the cup down in front of Ruth and looked at the snow coming down beyond the window glass. "That this place is worth something," she said. "The way it is." The snow that had started falling on Friday morning didn't stop until Sunday. By Monday, Frost Hollow had the particular muffled quality that deep snow gives to small towns. Sound deadened, movement slowed, the whole world contracted to whatever was immediately in front of you. Evelyn opened the bakery anyway. She always did. There had been exactly 3 days in 6 years when she hadn't opened, and 2 of those were when her mother died, and the third was the February. Her pipes burst and she'd spent 14 hours in the back kitchen with a heat gun trying to sort it out before she gave up and called a plumber from Lewiston. She'd thought about what Gideon said for the better part of the weekend. Not obsessively. She had dough to manage and accounts to review and a Saturday rush that had run longer than usual because of the snow. But the words had stayed somewhere at the back of her mind the way certain things do when they've touched something you've been protecting. This place is the best thing in this town, the way you do it. She'd told herself it was a simple compliment from a quiet man who didn't give many of them. And that was probably all it was. And she should not make it into more than it was. She'd had enough experience with attaching meaning to things that turned out to mean less than she'd hoped. That particular lesson had been expensive the first time around, and she'd no intention of paying for it again. Still, she thought about it. Victor Blackridge called on Saturday afternoon, which she'd expected. She let it go to voicemail and listened to the message twice. His tone was warmer than their meeting. He'd recalibrated, she could tell, dialed back the corporate register and replaced it with something that was trying to sound personal. He said he understood her hesitation. He said the terms were negotiable. He said he genuinely believed in what she'd built and wanted to help her protect it. That last word was the one she sat with. Protect. As though the thing that needed protection was the bakery from the outside world and not the bakery from what he was proposing to do to it. She didn't call back that day. She told herself she was still thinking, which was true, and also that she needed more information, which was less true, but felt better to say. The more accurate thing was that she was tired in a way that wasn't physical. The conversation with Victor, the look on Clara Hitchens' face when she made that gesture, the folder with its careful language about brand aesthetics and consumer expectations, it had accumulated over the week into something heavy, and she was carrying it the way she carried most heavy things, which was mostly by not stopping long enough to put it down. Ruth noticed on Monday. She came in at her usual time, unwound her scarf, dropped into her chair, and looked at Evelyn for a few seconds without saying anything, which was how Ruth signaled that she was paying attention. "You're doing the thing," Ruth said. "What thing?" "The thing where you move around like nothing's wrong and everything gets clean." Evelyn looked at the counter she'd been wiping. She'd been wiping it for approximately 4 minutes. "I'm just cleaning." "Evelyn." She put the cloth down, poured 2 cups of coffee and brought one around the counter and sat in the other chair, which she almost never did during business hours, and that alone told Ruth enough. "He called again," Evelyn said. "I figured. What did he say?" "That the terms are negotiable." She wrapped both hands around the cup. "Ruth, the money he's talking about, it would fix everything. The roof needs work. The oven is 14 years old, and I've been nursing it along for 2 years waiting for it to die. The back freezer, I know about the back freezer. Then you know that I'm not in a position to turn down serious money just because I don't like the person offering it." She heard how that sounded. "That came out wrong. I don't mean I'd take a bad deal. I just mean..." "What are the actual terms?" Ruth asked. "Not the money. The other parts." Evelyn was quiet for a moment. "He wants the recipes. Your mother's recipes." He'd retain the name. "I'd be brand ambassador for the launch period." She set the cup down. "And he wants me to work with his team on my appearance." for the marketing. Ruth didn't say anything for a moment. Outside, the snow was still thick on the ground, and the morning light came through the window flat and white. "He told you to lose weight," Ruth said. "He said the premium market has a specific visual language." "Same thing." Ruth's voice was not raised. It was the opposite. It went very level in a way that was more pointed than volume would have been. "Evelyn, you understand what he's actually buying, right? It's not the recipes. It's you. He wants to take the authentic thing that you are, strip out every part that doesn't fit his market research, put a version of it in a package, and sell that." She picked up her cup. "And the authentic thing that you are includes a body that apparently doesn't fit his aesthetic vision, and he has the nerve to put that in a contract." "I know what it is." "Then why are we still having this conversation?" Evelyn looked at her. "Because the roof needs work, and the oven is 14 years old, and I've been running on thin margins for 3 years, and some mornings I'm so tired I could put my head down on this counter and not get up." The words came out quieter than she'd meant them to. Ruth didn't look away. "I know," Ruth said. "I know you know. I just—" She stopped, pulled the cloth toward her without picking it up. "I want someone to tell me there's another way. But I can't see one right now, and I'm starting to wonder if I've been stubborn for so long that I've confused stubbornness with having principles. There's a difference between those things. Is there? Because from where I'm sitting, they look identical, and they both end up with me alone in this bakery at 4 in the morning, listening to an old oven make sounds that worry me." Ruth was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "What did Gideon say?" Evelyn looked up. "What?" "He came in Friday. I saw him through the window when I was walking past." "You both stood there for a while." Ruth raised an eyebrow. "What did he say?" "He asked if I was going to take the deal." She hesitated. "And then he said, 'This place is the best thing in this town.'" "Don't hum me." "I'm not humming you," Ruth said, in a tone that was absolutely humming her. "I'm just noting that a man who chooses his words extremely carefully said something. He was being neighborly. Gideon Ashcroft has come into this bakery every 2 weeks for 6 years. I've lived here my entire life, and I've had fewer than 10 conversations with that man total. He is not by nature neighborly." Ruth set her cup down. "I'm just saying." "Well, don't just say." Evelyn stood up. "Say what you actually mean or don't say it." Ruth looked at her for a moment. "I mean that sometimes people see things in us that we can't see ourselves, and sometimes we should pay attention to that instead of discounting it." She paused. "That's all I mean." Evelyn went back behind the counter. A moment later, the door opened and the Dawson kids came in, snow-covered and loud, and the conversation ended because the morning did what mornings do, which was require her attention. Victor Blackridge came into the bakery on Tuesday. He didn't come alone. He brought a woman named Simone, who was apparently his brand consultant, sleek, precise, with the particular efficiency of someone whose job it was to assess things quickly and professionally. And a man whose name Evelyn didn't catch, who stood near the door taking photographs of the interior on a tablet. This was the first time Evelyn had not been asked for permission for something in her own space, and the feeling it produced was specific and unpleasant, and she filed it away. Victor was in the good teeth, approachable mode. He ordered coffees for all 3 of them and paid and tipped and said, "I hope it's all right if we have a look around. Just getting a sense of the bones of the place." "It's a bakery," Evelyn said. "Not much to see." "That's not true at all." He looked around with what seemed like genuine appreciation and might have been. "This is exactly the kind of authentic space that can't be manufactured. The imperfections are the point. The mismatched chairs, the handwritten menu. People pay significant money to be in rooms that feel like this and can't, because it's real. You can feel the difference. What happens to the mismatched chairs when you renovate?" He paused. "Just barely. Just enough for her to catch. We'd be thoughtful about what we preserved." "That's not an answer. It's a process," he said. "These decisions get made collaboratively." She poured the coffees. Simone was standing near the back wall, studying the handwritten recipes tacked inside the open cabinet, with an expression that reminded Evelyn of an appraiser at an estate sale. Not disrespectful, exactly, just entirely transactional. "Can I ask you something directly?" Evelyn said. "Always. In your model, the chain you're building, After the launch phase, what does a regular Tuesday look like in one of your locations? Victor smiled. Efficient, streamlined, consistent customer experience across all sites. Who's baking? We'd have trained staff. Trained on what? On the standardized recipes, which would be developed with you based on your originals. So someone I've never met, working in a building I've never been in, using a formula derived from my mother's recipes, serving people who think they're getting something real. She looked at him. And the whole thing is called Mercer's. The word hung there. Victor's expression held steady, in the way of someone who'd been in enough rooms to have practiced holding it steady. Evelyn, the value of what you've created here is the story, the authenticity. The authenticity, she said, is the thing you want to remove. That's literally what a standardized formula is. You take out the variation, you take out the judgment calls, you take out the fact that I know this particular oven runs hot on the left side and I compensate for that every single morning. She set the coffee pot down. That's not a brand asset. That's just me doing this job the way I learned it. Simone turned from the cabinet. Ms. Mercer, I understand your attachment to the process, but the market, I'm not attached to the process. I am the process. That's different. Evelyn looked at her carefully. I think you know that. I think that's actually what's in the contract. Simone looked at Victor. Victor looked at Evelyn. The offer is generous, he said. I want you to have real time to consider it. I'll be in town through the end of the month. He put a business card on the counter, heavier card stock than necessary, the kind meant to communicate seriousness. The terms I mentioned on the phone, I meant that. We can talk about adjustments. You can adjust the money, Evelyn said. You can't adjust the other parts because those are the parts that make the deal work for you. He didn't deny it. She respected that in a reluctant way. After they left, she stood at the counter and looked at the business card for a long moment, then slid it into the register drawer where she put things she wasn't done with yet. Clara Hitchens organized the meeting. She called it a community conversation, which was the kind of phrase that meant a group of people had decided something and wanted to make it feel like a decision that was still open. She used the phrase Evelyn's opportunity several times, which made it sound as though the opportunity might expire if Evelyn didn't act quickly enough, like milk. It was held in the back room of the diner on Wednesday evening. About 20 people showed up, which was most of the business owners on the main street, plus a few others who Clara had apparently specifically invited. Evelyn found out about it because Hector Malm mentioned it when he came in for his rye that morning, with the careful delicacy of a man who wasn't sure if he was delivering news or confirming something she already knew. She went. She almost didn't, but she went, because refusing to show up to a conversation about her own future felt like a kind of surrender. The back room of the diner had folding chairs arranged in a rough circle and a coffee urn that had been going too long. Clara was at the front of the room in the way that people plant themselves at the front of rooms when they've organized things. She greeted Evelyn with a warmth that was just slightly too pronounced to be comfortable. We're so glad you came, Clara said. We just wanted a chance to talk through all of this together as a community, because what happens to the bakery affects all of us. I know that, Evelyn said. She found a chair in the circle and sat in it and felt, not for the first time, like a topic. What followed was 40 minutes that Evelyn would have liked to not remember in as much detail as she did. The general theme was that Victor Blackridge's offer was an exceptional opportunity for Frost Hollow as a whole, and that community support for local businesses meant supporting them and making smart choices even when those choices were hard. Dave Pullman from the hardware store talked about how investment attracted investment. The woman who'd recently opened a small pottery studio near the edge of town said that profile raised all boats. Several people said versions of the phrase, "This is just business," with the confidence of people who had decided that phrase ended conversations. Nobody said directly what they meant, but it accumulated the way these things do. Through the weight of many almost statements, many careful pauses, many looks that contained the opinion being withheld. The overall communication, delivered without anyone being unkind enough to actually deliver it, was, take the deal, change what needs changing, stop letting your attachment to how things are get in the way of how things could be. And underneath all of it, never stated but present in the room, the way cold is present in a room with a drafty window. This includes you, not just the bakery. Evelyn sat and listened. She was good at listening. She heard every word that was said and every word that wasn't. At one point, Clara said, "We all want what's best for you, Evelyn. And I think sometimes when you're inside something, it's hard to see it clearly. We're just offering perspective." "I appreciate that," Evelyn said. "You've worked so hard for so long. You deserve to have something easier, to look—" Clara stopped. "To have something that really reflects everything you've put into it." The pause before look was brief enough that half the room probably didn't notice it. Evelyn noticed it. She'd had years of practice at noticing those pauses. "Thank you," she said, and her voice was level, and she sat through the rest of it. On the walk home, the cold was hard and clean, and the snow creaked under her boots, and she walked slowly with her hands in her pockets, thinking about what it felt like to be in a room full of people who'd eaten her bread for years and still couldn't see past the container it came in. She thought about her mother, who had been a large woman too, who had moved through this town with a particular unbothered quality that Evelyn had always admired and never quite understood. She'd asked her mother about it once, when she was in high school, after a bad week of the kind that high school produces. Her mother had been at the work table, both arms in dough, and she'd said without stopping, "People are going to have opinions about your body until the day you die. That's not going away. The question is whether their opinions get to live in your house." Evelyn had thought about that for years. She still thought about it. The question was whether she believed it on the days when the opinions were being expressed by a room full of people she'd known her whole life, using the faces of people who meant well and the language of people who were trying to help. She stopped in front of the bakery. The lights were off. Through the side window, she could see the pilot light glow. She stood there in the cold for a long time, not going in, not going anywhere else. Somewhere up in the Bitterroot Range, 14 miles north of where she was standing, there was a man in a cabin who had come into her bakery a week early and said the truest thing anyone had said to her in months. She didn't know what to do with that. She didn't know what to do with most of it. She went inside. She checked the sourdough starter. She turned off the lamp above the work table. She did not sleep well that night, and the following morning she got up at 4 o'clock and went back to work. Because that was what she did. Because the bread didn't care about any of it. And because the act of making something good and real with her hands was, at the moment, the only thing that felt entirely solid underneath her. 3 days after the community meeting, Victor Blackridge came back to the bakery with a revised contract. He didn't announce it as revised. He set it on the counter the way you set something down when you want it to appear casual, and said he'd had his legal team look at a few things, and he thought she'd find the new version addressed some of her concerns. Evelyn dried her hands on her apron and picked it up and read it where she stood, because she wasn't going to take it to the back kitchen and read it alone and come back with an answer. She'd learned that much about negotiation from watching Dale operate. The person who leaves the room gives something up. The money was higher. The royalty structure on the recipes was more favorable. The brand ambassador timeline had been shortened. The section about her appearance was still there. The language had been softened. Collaborates with brand team on presentation standards instead of the earlier version. But the meaning was identical. She read it twice to make sure she wasn't being uncharitable. She was not being uncharitable. "The presentation section," she said, "Victor was ready for this. We refined the language significantly. The language is different. The requirement is the same." She set the contract on the counter between them. "You still need me to change how I look. We need the brand face to be consistent with—" "I understand what you need," she said. "I'm telling you what I'm not willing to do." He was quiet for a moment. Outside, the November wind pushed something across the street. A paper cup, maybe, skittering fast along the frozen sidewalk. "Evelyn," he said, and his voice shifted into the register she'd been waiting for, the one that came out when the professional pleasantness had run its course. "I've been patient. I've revised the terms twice. I've come to your town, eaten your food, listened to your concerns. At some point, a business person has to decide whether they want to succeed or whether they want to be right." He paused. "Which one do you want?" It was a good line. She could tell he'd used it before, probably successfully. "I want to be right," she said. "In the specific sense that I want to run my business the way I think is correct. And I can't do that inside your structure." She picked up the contract and held it out to him. "I'm sorry you came all this way." He didn't take it right away. He looked at her with an expression that was trying to figure out whether there was another angle, and she could see the calculation happening, and then he took the contract and folded it and put it in the inside pocket of his coat. "I'll be in town through the end of the month," he said. His voice had gone professional again. No warmth, but no heat either. Just the flat tone of someone closing a meeting. "If you change your mind." "I won't." He left. The door closed. The warmth settled back. Evelyn stood at the counter for a moment, and what she felt was not triumph. It was the particular feeling of having made the right choice while simultaneously knowing that the right choice was going to cost her, and the bill was already in the mail. She pulled the cloth from her apron and went back to work. She told Ruth that afternoon. Ruth put her hand over Evelyn's on the counter and said, "Good," and didn't say anything else, which was the exact right thing. She did not tell Clara Hitchens or anyone else. She knew the town would find out. It always did. And she preferred to let that happen on its own schedule, rather than making an announcement that would require her to perform confidence she was still working to actually feel. The call came on a Thursday, 10 days after she'd turned Victor down. She was in the back kitchen at 7 in the morning, and her phone was on the shelf above the work table, and when it rang, the screen showed a number she didn't recognize, a Lewiston area code. She almost let it go. She picked it up on the third ring because she'd learned from years of running a small business that unknown numbers were usually either nothing or something you needed to deal with promptly. It was the bank, not a regular branch manager, who she'd known for 4 years and who had the decency to be uncomfortable when the conversation was uncomfortable. This was someone from a different office, regional, she gathered, from the title he gave in the formal introduction at the start of the call. His tone was professionally neutral in the way that delivered bad news without appearing to deliver it. The line of credit she'd taken out 2 years ago to replace the walk-in cooler was coming up for its annual review. Given current conditions, he used the phrase current conditions several times, which appeared to mean her refusal of the Blackridge deal, though he never said this directly. The bank was tightening its lending posture and wanted to discuss the repayment terms. In plain language, they wanted the balance accelerated. She asked him to repeat the figure. He did. She wrote it on the back of an order slip and looked at it for a moment and felt the number settle through her the way cold water does. Immediately, completely, reaching everywhere at once. "When?" she said. "We'd like to begin that conversation within the next 30 days. She said she understood and thanked him and hung up and stood in the back kitchen with her hand still on the phone and the number on the slip of paper and the oven behind her running its normal low hum. She did not panic. She had a rule about not panicking, established during the worst of the Dale years when panicking had never once helped anything and had on several occasions made things substantially worse. She made coffee and she sat at the small table in the back and she added up the number she already knew and got the result she'd expected, which was that she did not have the balance and could not generate it in 30 days by any means that were available to her without the bakery operating well beyond its current capacity. Victor Blackridge's business card was in the register drawer. She did not get it out. She made herself sit with the numbers for a full 10 minutes before she did anything, because she knew herself well enough to know that the first impulse in a crisis was often the one that solved the crisis by making it into a different, worse crisis. After 10 minutes, she got up and opened the bakery and did her morning. She served the Dawson kids who came in before school. She filled Hector Malm's standing order. She sold 18 cinnamon rolls by 9:30, which was actually a good morning. She smiled at people and took their money and answered their questions, and the whole time the number on the slip of paper sat in the back of her mind with the particular weight of a problem that wasn't going to resolve itself through ignoring it. By noon, she had made a list of things she could liquidate, loans she might approach, suppliers she could defer payment to without damaging the relationships. It was not a reassuring list. It was the kind of list you make because making a list is doing something, and doing something is better than not doing something, even if the list doesn't actually solve your problem. She was still looking at the list when the front door opened and it was Clara Hitchens, and Evelyn knew by the expression on Clara's face, a particular blend of sympathy and the barely contained energy of someone carrying news, that the town had found out about the bank. "I heard," Clara said, before she'd even gotten her coat off. "News travels," Evelyn said, which was the same thing she'd said to Gideon, and which was beginning to feel like the only accurate statement she had about Frost Hollow. Evelyn. Clara came to the counter. She was doing the concerned face, the one that was genuine probably, but that also served the purpose of introducing whatever the concern was going to lead to. "I want you to know that I think you were brave to turn him down." "I do. But, Clara, I also think there's still time. He's still in town. His offer is still. I'm not calling him. I'm not saying call him today. I'm saying. She lowered her voice even though they were alone in the room. Dave Pullman talked to him. After you said no. And he said Victor was disappointed but not done. He said there might be room to revisit. He told Dave Pullman this. Word gets around. Yes, Evelyn said with a patience she was depleting. It does. I'm trying to help. I know you are, Clara. She meant it, mostly, but helping me and pushing me toward this deal are not the same thing, and I need you to understand that. Clara was quiet for a moment. Then she said softly, with what was probably her most genuine version of concern, What are you going to do? Evelyn looked at her. I'm going to figure it out. She said it with more conviction than she had. But conviction was sometimes a thing you had to perform before you could actually feel it. And performing it in front of Clara Hitchens was at least more useful than performing it alone in the back kitchen. After Clara left, she poured herself a coffee she didn't drink and stood at the counter and looked at the room. The mismatched chairs, the handwritten menu, the glass case with its paper labels. And she thought about what Victor had said. The imperfections are the point. You can feel the difference. He'd meant it as a sales pitch, but he'd also, in the way that people sometimes say true things while selling something, been accurate. She'd built this place imperfect. She'd kept it imperfect. Every mismatched chair was from a different estate sale or a neighbor who was clearing out, and she knew the story of most of them if she tried. The menu board had been rewritten 40 times, but always in the same chalk script she'd learned from her mother. The glass case had a crack in the lower left corner, sealed with a thin bead of clear silicone, that had been there since the second year she'd been back. None of it was what Victor's brand team would have designed. All of it was real. She just needed 30 days worth of real to become enough money to keep the bank off her back. And she didn't know how to do that without help. She wasn't sure how to ask for. She didn't sleep well again that Thursday night, or Friday. By Saturday morning, she was running on 4 hours, and the specific alertness that comes from being too tired to relax, which produces a heightened, slightly unreal quality to everything. Colors a little sharper, sounds a little too present. She was pulling the first cinnamon rolls from the oven at 6:50 when she heard the front door. Early, before she'd flipped the sign. She wiped her hands and went to the front thinking it was probably Hector, who sometimes came before she was open if he'd forgotten the day before, and she'd never had the heart to turn him away. It was not Hector. Gideon Ashcroft was standing just inside the door with snow on his shoulders, which meant he'd come down from the mountain that morning, which meant he'd left the cabin before dawn. He was holding something, a canvas pack, which he set on the floor just inside the door with the careful movements of someone carrying something heavy. You're not open, he said, as though this was information he was delivering rather than obvious to both of them. I was about to be, she said. Come in. Coffee? He came to the counter. She poured a cup and set it down, and he wrapped his hands around it and didn't drink for a moment, just held it, and she noticed his hands were cold. White at the knuckles the way hands got when you'd been outside in serious cold for several hours. Early trip, she said. I wanted to get down before the weather turns. He looked at her. You look tired. Thank you, Gideon. He stopped. I didn't mean it as, I know. She almost smiled. I am tired. I had a bad week. The bank, he said. She looked at him. You heard. Mom mentioned it. I ran into him at Hadley's yesterday. She nodded. The coffee was good this morning. She'd measured it right, which wasn't always the case when she was tired. It's being handled, she said, which was what she said to everyone because she hadn't worked out yet how to say, I don't know how to handle it to people who depended on the place staying open. How, Gideon said. Not how are you handling it, just how, flat and direct, the way he said most things. I'm still working that out. He was quiet. He drank the coffee, and she went back to the front of the oven and did what needed doing, and he sat at the counter and didn't talk, which was fine. His silences were not uncomfortable ones. She'd noticed this years ago. Most people who didn't talk felt like they were withholding something, and his silences felt like the opposite, like he was simply present without needing to fill the space. When she came back to the counter with the first tray of rolls, he said, What's the number? I'm not going to... Evelyn. He looked at her steadily. What's the number? She told him. She wasn't entirely sure why. She hadn't told Ruth, hadn't told anyone, but the way he'd asked it made refusing feel like a performance she didn't have the energy for. He nodded once. His expression didn't change in any readable way. He picked up his coffee and finished it, and set the cup down carefully. "I need to think about something," he said. "Okay, I'll come back." "Gideon, whatever you're—" "I'll come back," he said again. And there was something in his voice that stopped her mid-sentence. Not firm exactly, but settled, the way the mountain was settled, like the decision had already been made and what remained was only logistics. He picked up the canvas pack from near the door and left. She stood at the counter looking at the space where he'd been, and she wasn't sure what she felt exactly. Something shifted. Something that had been pulled tight for days relaxed by a small degree. She didn't know what he was thinking about or what coming back meant. But the settled quality in his voice had been real, and she trusted her ear for things that were real, because she'd spent years learning to hear the difference. Isan. He came back on Monday. It was 10 in the morning, mid-rush, and the bakery had 6 or 7 people in it when the door opened and Gideon came in. He'd cleaned up from the weekend. The beard was trimmed. The canvas coat was the one he wore when he came to town, rather than the heavier work one he used up the mountain. And he was carrying the same canvas pack from Saturday, which was clearly not empty. He came directly to the counter and waited for her to finish with the customer she was serving. She did, and the customer, one of the Dawson boys' teachers, a young woman named Amy, who'd recently moved to Frost Hollow, collected her order and stepped aside, and Gideon set the canvas pack on the counter with a careful, deliberate movement. Clara Hitchens was in the room. So was Dave Pullman, who'd come in for his Wednesday bread, even though it was Monday. So was Nora Sims, in her chair by the window, who'd been reading her library book but had put it down when Gideon walked in. "I've been trapping for 15 years, Gideon said. His voice was low, but the room was not loud. "I don't spend much." He opened the pack. He took out a leather pouch, thick and soft with use, and he set it on the counter. Then a second one. Then an envelope, sealed, which he placed beside the pouches. He didn't say anything while he did this, just placed each one down flat, organized, as though he'd arranged this in his head beforehand. "This is what I have," he said. Evelyn looked at the pouches and the envelope. She looked at him. "Gideon, it's enough to cover the bank balance," he said, "plus some buffer." He paused. I counted it twice. The room had gone quiet. She was aware of this, the way conversation stops when the register drops. But she kept her eyes on Gideon. "I can't take your savings," she said. "It's not a gift," he said. I'm not giving it to you. He stopped, and for the first time in the conversation he looked uncertain, which was not an expression she'd seen on his face before. I thought about how to say this. I thought about it for 2 days. He looked at her directly. "I want to be an investor in this place. Whatever that looks like, silent partner, I work for you, I don't care. But I'm not giving it to you. It's a business arrangement." Clara Hitchens made a small sound from across the room. Dave Pullman had stopped pretending to look at the bread. "Why?" Evelyn said. Her voice came out quieter than she'd intended. "Because this place should stay open," he said. "Because it's real. Because—" He stopped again, and she could see the 2 days of thinking behind the pause, the words that had been arranged and rearranged. "Because you built something worth building, and a man with more money than sense is not going to be the reason it closes." The room was very quiet. "And," he said, and his voice was different now, lower and careful, with the quality of something that had been held in a long time. "Because I've been coming in here for 6 years, and it was never about the bread." She stood still. "I should have said this a long time ago," he said. "I know that. I'm not good at this, but I'm good at knowing what's worth standing up for, and you are. What you've built here is, and I'm not going to stand outside it anymore and watch someone take it apart." The silence lasted several seconds. Nora Sims, by the window, had her hand over her mouth. "Gideon," Evelyn said. Her voice had something in it she couldn't quite manage out. "You've been coming here every 2 weeks for 6 years. "Yes, and you never—" "I know," he said. "I know I didn't." He didn't look away. "I'm saying it now." Clara Hitchens said in a voice that was absolutely not supposed to be heard, "Well, I'll be." Neither of them looked at her. Evelyn looked at the pouches and the envelope on her counter. The weight of 15 years of solitary work. The particular gravity of a man who'd carried this for 6 years without saying a word, and she felt something shift in the room around her. A collective exhale from the people in it. A recognition that whatever was happening here was not a business transaction. "I need to think," she said. "Okay," he said. "About all of it." "Okay," he said again. "You can't just—" She stopped, pressed her hands flat on the counter. "You can't just walk in here and do this and then stand there and be calm about it." "I'm not calm," he said. He didn't look not calm, but she looked at his hands on the counter's edge and saw the knuckles were white, and understood that the stillness was not absence of feeling, but the opposite. Feeling held so tightly that releasing any of it required everything he had. The door opened. Victor Blackridge stepped into the bakery. He took in the scene, the pack on the counter, the pouches, the room full of silent people, Evelyn and Gideon standing 2 feet apart. And to his credit, he read it correctly and immediately. His expression shifted. Not to anger exactly, to the recalibrated look of someone whose timeline had just changed. "Evelyn," he said, "I'm sorry to interrupt. I just wanted to—" "Not now, Victor," she said, and the directness of it surprised even her. He looked at Gideon. Gideon looked back at him with the flat, easy attention of a man who'd spent 15 years in the wilderness and had learned not to perform calm because he simply was calm. "I see," Victor said. "Good," Evelyn said. The room waited. Victor Blackridge picked up his coffee cup from the end of the counter. He'd left it there from earlier, she realized, and walked back to the door and let himself out with the quiet click of someone who'd decided that the meeting was over. Nobody spoke for a moment. Then Nora Sims said from her chair by the window, in the dry tone of a 71-year-old woman who had seen most things and found very few of them surprising, "Well, Tuesday got interesting. It was Monday." But nobody corrected her. Evelyn looked at Gideon. He was watching her with that expression again, the one Clara had described years ago as figuring something out. And she understood now that it wasn't calculation. It was the look of a man who had been hoping for something for a long time and was watching the possibility of it appear right in front of him and was trying very hard to breathe normally while it happened. "The money?" she said. "I need time to think about the money." "I know. And the other part, I know that too." The corner of his mouth moved, the almost smile she'd been seeing for 6 years. "I'm not going anywhere." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked at the room full of people who were watching, and at Nora Sims, who had not picked her book back up, and at Clara Hitchens, who was going to have a very productive afternoon, and she felt, in the midst of all of it, underneath the weight of the bank balance and the exhaustion and the 2 days of numbers, something she hadn't felt in a while. Like the thing underneath her was solid, like she was standing on ground that wasn't going anywhere. She reached out and put her hand on the canvas pack. "I'll hold this," she said. "While I think," Gideon nodded. The chin drop, the almost nod. "Take your time," he said. She put the canvas pack under the counter that night, in the low cabinet where she kept the extra receipt rolls and a spare apron, and for reasons she'd never examined, her mother's old kitchen shears. She locked the cabinet. She didn't open it again before she went home. She didn't sleep well. This was becoming a pattern. She lay in the dark in her house 4 blocks from the bakery and looked at the ceiling and did the thing she'd been trying not to do, which was think about what Gideon had said in sequence. Not the money part, which was complicated enough on its own, but the other part, the 6 years part. It was never about the bread. She'd known, she realized. Not known exactly, not in any way she could have pointed to and described with precision. But there had been something in the quality of his attention for years that she'd filed away in the category of things she didn't examine. She'd been very deliberate about that category. It had gotten large over time. The problem was that the category existed because she didn't trust her own read on certain things, specifically on whether a man's attention meant what it appeared to mean. Dale Mercer had looked at her a particular way in the beginning, with the focused warmth of someone who wanted you, and she'd believed it completely. And then she'd spent the following years slowly discovering that his attention had been about something else, some project of his that she'd been a useful part of. and that the warmth had been real enough in its way, but contingent on her performing a version of herself that narrowed every year. After that, she decided she was bad at reading this particular thing, and the safest course was to not read it at all, which had worked fine, which had been, she understood, lying in the dark, its own kind of loss. She thought about his hands on the edge of the counter, the white knuckles. He'd said, "I'm not calm," and he'd been right, and the fact that she'd had to look at his hands to know it was its own thing. He'd learned to hold himself so still that the feeling only showed in the places he couldn't control. She knew something about that. She got up at 3:45 and gave up on sleep and went to the bakery because the bakery was the place she thought most clearly. Mom. Ruth came in at her usual time Friday morning and took one look at Evelyn and said, "You're in love with him. Good morning to you too. You've had this look all week. I've been trying to figure it out." "I don't have a look." "You have a very specific look," Ruth said, sitting down, "like someone handed you something valuable and you're afraid to put it in your pocket in case you lose it." Evelyn poured the coffee and came around the counter and sat in the other chair. This had become, over the week, a twice-daily thing, sitting for 10 minutes when Ruth came in, and she recognized that she was doing it because she needed the ballast. "I don't know what I feel," she said. That's the honest answer. "Okay, what do you know?" "I know that he said something true. About what this place is. About—" She stopped. "He's been seeing me clearly for 6 years, Ruth, without me knowing, and I don't know what to do with that. Maybe you don't have to do anything with it yet. Maybe you just have to figure out the money situation first and let the rest develop at its own pace. They're not separate things." "No," Ruth agreed, "but they don't have to be solved at the same time." Evelyn looked at her coffee. "I keep thinking about what he gave up to bring that money down here. 15 years of working alone up a mountain. That's not— You don't do that for a business investment." "No," Ruth said again, "you don't. Which means if I use it to save the bakery, there's a weight attached. Not because he'd use it against me. I don't think he would. I genuinely don't think that's who he is. But because I'd know. Every morning when I opened the door, I'd know. So talk to him. About what exactly? About what it means. What he expects. What you want." Ruth looked at her steadily. "You're good at a lot of things, Evelyn. Letting people help you is not one of them." This was true, and they both knew it, and Evelyn didn't bother denying it. "I don't know how to have that conversation," she said. "You go find him and you start talking and you see where it goes. He's up the mountain. I'm aware of where he lives." Ruth picked up her cup. "I'm also aware that you closed the bakery at 2 o'clock last January to drive 40 minutes through a snowstorm to take soup to the Dawson family when their mother had the flu. So I'm not going to accept that 14 miles is too far." Evelyn looked at her. "Figure out the money," Ruth said, "then go up the mountain. In that order, or not, I don't know your life. But stop sitting here making yourself tired deciding whether you deserve the thing before you've even reached for it." The morning rush came in then, the door opening, voices, the particular noise of Frost Hollow beginning its day. And Evelyn got up and went back behind the counter and did her work. And she turned Ruth's last sentence over in her mind for the rest of the morning, like a stone she kept finding in her pocket. Wait. She called the bank on Friday afternoon and asked for a 60-day extension on the accelerated repayment. The regional manager, the same one from the earlier call, the one with the professionally neutral voice, said he'd need to review the request and would be in touch early the following week. His tone was not encouraging. It was the tone of someone delivering a probable no with enough wiggle room to avoid being quoted. She was on the phone with him in the back kitchen, standing at the work table, and when she hung up, she stood there for a moment. And then she opened the low cabinet and took out the canvas pack. She sat at the small table in the back and she opened the pouches and counted what was in them. She'd known roughly. Gideon had told her it was enough to cover the balance, but she hadn't touched it since Monday, hadn't wanted to make it more real before she'd decided what she was deciding. The bills were worn and soft in the way of money that's been held and handled, not crisp from an ATM. The envelope held the rest. She counted it twice the way he'd said he'd counted it, and the total was what he'd said it was, plus a margin that was not large but was real. 15 years of a man living alone on a mountain, spending as little as possible, bringing it down in pouches and an envelope and putting it on her counter. She put it back carefully. She sat with her hands on the table and looked at the crock of sourdough starter on its shelf. the 11-year-old culture her mother had kept for 32 years before her. And she thought about what it meant to keep something alive that mattered, and what it cost, and what you did when someone offered to help you do it. She made a decision. She called her accountant, Tom Greer, on Saturday morning before the bakery opened. Tom was 63 and had been handling her books since she'd come back to Frost Hollow, and he had the manner of a man who'd seen enough small business crises to find them less alarming than his clients did, which was usually comforting. "I have a potential private investor," she told him. "I want to know what a clean, fair arrangement looks like for both parties." Tom asked a few questions, and she answered them, and he said he'd put something together and send it to her Monday. "One more thing," she said. "I want it structured so there's a clear exit. If he wants out or I want to buy him out, there's a number and a process. No ambiguity." "Smart," Tom said. "I want it to be a business arrangement. Actually, one, not the word for something else." "I understand," Tom said, in the tone of a man who'd probably heard something like this before. She hung up and opened the bakery and worked her Saturday, and the cinnamon rolls sold out by 9, and the Dawson kids came in and she let them have the ones she'd set aside for herself. And the morning had its ordinary rhythms, and she moved through them and felt, underneath the tiredness and the unresolved weight of everything, something that was not quite peace, but was its near neighbor. Now, Victor Blackridge came into the bakery one final time on Monday. She'd expected this. He was not a man who left threads untied. His entire professional identity was built on bringing things to resolution, and leaving Frost Hollow without a definitive close to this particular situation would have been, for him, untidy. The bakery was quiet, mid-morning between rushes. He came in alone this time, no Simone, no man with the tablet. He ordered a coffee and waited while she poured it, and he set the exact money on the counter without making her ask for it, which she noted. "I'm not going to make another offer," he said. "I want you to know that. This isn't that. Okay, I came to say that I think you made the wrong business decision, and I also think you made the right personal one, and those two things can both be true." He picked up the coffee. "I've been doing this for 20 years. I can usually tell the difference between someone who doesn't know what they have and someone who knows exactly what they have and isn't going to give it up. I should have seen that earlier with you." She looked at him. This was, she thought, as close to an apology as his personality allowed, and she found she could respect it. "The presentation requirement," she said. "In the contract." "Yes. Did you know, when you wrote it, what you were asking?" He held the cup and looked at her with an expression that was more honest than most of what she'd seen from him. "Yes," he said. And I put it in anyway because the market data supported it, and I thought you'd take the money." A pause. "I underestimated what the bakery meant to you. And I think..." Another pause, shorter, like he was deciding how much of this to actually say. "I think I underestimated you." "I know," she said. He nodded. He finished the coffee and set the cup down and picked up his coat from the stool beside him. "For what it's worth," he said, at the door, "the man who put that money on your counter on Monday, I've dealt with a lot of investors. I've never seen anyone make a case for a business the way he made one for yours." He almost smiled. Not with the money, before the money, the way he stood there. He left. She stood at the counter and looked at the door for a moment after it closed, and then she went into the back kitchen and took the canvas pack out of the cabinet, and she called Tom Greer and confirmed he was sending the paperwork, and then she did something she'd been moving toward all week without quite admitting it. She closed the bakery at noon. She left a note on the door. "Closed for the afternoon, back tomorrow at 6:30, in the chalk she used for the daily specials, and she went home and she changed into warmer clothes, and she got in her truck. She'd been up the road toward the Bitterroot Range twice before in her life, once as a teenager on a school hiking trip, once a few years back when she'd gone with Ruth to see the fall colors. She knew roughly where the turnoff was. She didn't know the rest. It took her longer than she'd calculated. The road got bad 5 miles from town, not impassable, but not a road that forgave inattention. And by the time she found the secondary track that seemed to head further up, she'd been driving for 40 minutes and the trees had closed in on both sides, and the afternoon light was already thinning the way it did fast in November. The cabin appeared around a bend in the track, in a small clearing that had been made deliberately. She could tell because the arrangement of it was too purposeful to be accident, the way it sat with its back to the slope and its face to the south for the light. It was not large, but it was solid in a way that spoke of someone who'd built it with the intention of it lasting. The logs were fitted tight, the roof was steep for snow load, the chimney was stone. A cord and a half of split wood was stacked along the south wall under an overhang, the pieces evenly sized, the rows clean. There was smoke coming from the chimney. She sat in the truck for a moment with the engine running. The clearing was very quiet except for the wind in the upper branches. The cold was a different quality up here than in town, cleaner, with an edge to it that reached right through clothing. She turned off the engine and got out. She was halfway across the clearing when the cabin door opened and Gideon stepped out. He was in his work clothes, the canvas shirt, the heavy boots, and he had a splitting axe in his right hand, which he'd apparently been using on the round section of log visible next to the woodpile. He looked at her truck. He looked at her. His expression did the thing it sometimes did, the almost expression, the thing at the boundary of what he allowed himself to show. "You drove up," he said. "I did. The lower road gets—" I managed. He set the axe against the woodpile and looked at her. The cold was between them, and the smoke from the chimney went straight up in the still air. "You could have called," he said. "I have a satellite phone." "I know. I wanted to come in person." She put her hands in her coat pockets. "I called my accountant. He's putting together a proper partnership agreement. Real terms, buyout clause, everything documented. I want it to be a real business arrangement." "Okay, I'm going to pay you back. Fully. With interest at whatever rate Tom thinks is fair." She looked at him steadily. "And that's separate from— It's separate from the other thing you said. The two things don't cancel each other out, and they don't obligate each other. They're two separate things." He was quiet for a moment. "You drove up a bad mountain road in November to tell me that. I didn't want there to be any confusion." "There isn't," he said. "I was clear about the terms when I put the money on the counter." "I know you were." She exhaled, and the cold took her breath and made it visible for a moment before it disappeared. But I needed to say it out loud, so I knew I'd said it. She looked at the cabin, the woodpile, the clearing, the way he'd arranged all of it to last. "And I wanted to see where you live." Something shifted in his face. "Why?" "Because you've been coming to see where I live for 6 years. Because—" She stopped and felt the cold in the altitude and the particular silence of a mountain afternoon, and decided that she had driven up a bad road in November and she was going to say the thing she'd come to say. "Because you told me something true and important, and you did it in front of half the town, which couldn't have been easy for you, and I wanted to answer you somewhere that wasn't a crowd." He waited. "I don't know what I feel," she said. "I want to be honest about that. I know what I've started to think this week, but thinking and knowing are different, and I've been wrong before in ways that cost me, so I'm not going to stand here and I'm not going to make you a promise I don't know if I can keep." She met his eyes. "What I can tell you is that I want to find out, if you do." The wind moved through the clearing just briefly. The smoke shifted and straightened again. "I've been wanting to find out for 6 years," he said. "I know. I'm sorry it took me this long to—" "Don't," he said. "Don't apologize for it. You didn't know. I didn't say anything. Why didn't you?" He looked at her with the specific honesty of someone who'd thought about a question for a long time and arrived at an answer he wasn't proud of and was going to say it anyway. "Because I thought you'd say no. And if you said no, I'd lose the 2 weeks." He paused. "The coming down, it was enough for a long time. I told myself it was enough." She understood that more than she would have expected. The careful reduction of what you allowed yourself to want, because wanting the larger thing meant risking the smaller thing you'd already secured. "Was it?" she asked. "No," he said. "Not anymore." She looked at him standing in the clearing in the cold with the mountain behind him and the smoke going straight up and the woodpile stacked exactly right, and she thought about 6 years of 2-week visits and exact change and almost smiles, and words stopped at the door, and she thought about her mother's crock of sourdough starter and what it meant to tend something carefully over a long period of time without knowing what it would become. "I should get back before the road gets dark," she said. "Yeah." He moved toward her, not quickly, just across the clearing to where she stood. He stopped at a foot's distance. "I'll come down Wednesday." "Honey wheat," she said. "Yeah." The corner of his mouth moved. "And whatever else." She drove down the mountain as the last of the afternoon light left the sky, and the road was exactly as bad as it had been on the way up, and she navigated it carefully with both hands on the wheel and the heater running and something she hadn't had in a long time sitting in her chest. Not happiness exactly, not yet, but the specific feeling of a door being opened onto a room you'd been standing outside for years. The town appeared below her as she came around the last bend, small and lit against the dark, and she drove into it the way she'd driven into it every day for 6 years, and it looked the same as always and was not quite the same. She parked in front of the bakery and sat for a moment. Through the side window, she could see the pilot light glow, the same blue-gray it always was, the same small, reliable warmth. She went inside. She checked the sourdough starter. She turned on the lamp above the work table and looked at the brown-edged recipe cards in the cabinet, her mother's handwriting still clear after all the years, and she thought, "This is mine. This is real. And it is enough, and more than enough, and I'm not going to give it away." She went home, and for the first time in 2 weeks, she slept without lying awake running numbers. The problem wasn't solved. The bank call was still coming. The arrangement with Tom was still being drafted. The road ahead still had difficulty in it. None of that had resolved. But she knew what she was keeping. And she knew who was going to help her keep it. That was enough to sleep on. Tom Greer sent the draft partnership agreement on Tuesday morning, and Evelyn read it at the work table in the back kitchen before the bakery opened, with coffee going and the oven warming and the particular stillness of 5:30 in the morning that she'd always liked best about her days. Tom had done it right. The terms were clean. Gideon's investment converted to a 20% equity stake, with a structured buyout option exercisable by either party after 3 years, interest accruing at a modest but fair rate. Everything documented in language that said what it meant without requiring a lawyer to decode it. There was a page of operational notes that Tom had added without being asked, laying out what a silent partnership actually meant in practice, what decisions required consultation, what remained entirely Evelyn's call, where the line was. She read the operational notes twice. The line was clear. She appreciated that Tom had understood, without her having to say it directly, that clarity was the thing she needed most. She printed 2 copies on the small printer she kept for invoices, and put them in an envelope and set the envelope on the counter. Gideon came in at 8:15, not at his usual 2-week interval, not early in the way that signaled something, just Wednesday, like he'd said. He came in when the morning rush was thinning, which she suspected was deliberate, and he ordered his honey wheat and she poured his coffee and slid the envelope across the counter without preamble. "Tom's draft," she said. "Read it when you have time. If the terms don't work for you, tell me and we'll adjust." He picked it up. "Okay, the interest rate is on page 2. Tom thought it was fair. "I think it's fair, but it's negotiable." "Evelyn." He looked at her. "I'll read it. I know, I want you to know I took it seriously. The arrangement, I know you did." He put the envelope in his coat pocket and picked up his coffee. "How'd you sleep?" The question surprised her slightly, not because it was strange, but because it was so ordinary. The kind of thing you asked someone you were checking on, and she hadn't had someone check on her in that particular tone in a long time. "Better," she said. "First time in 2 weeks." "Good," he said, and drank his coffee, and the morning went on around them. He brought the signed agreement back on Friday. No changes to the terms. She filed 1 copy in the lockbox under the register where she kept the important papers, and she mailed the other to Tom, and she called the bank with the account numbers and paid the accelerated balance in full before the regional manager could call her with his probable no. The woman who processed the payment on the phone said, "Is there anything else I can help you with today?" in the scripted tone of someone ending a transaction. "No," Evelyn said, "that's all." She hung up and stood at the work table for a moment and breathed, and the breath came out differently than it had been coming out for 3 weeks. Less held, less braced for impact. And then she went back out front and opened the afternoon rush, and did not mention it to anyone. She told Ruth on Friday. Ruth said, "Good," and hugged her, which Ruth didn't often do, and which meant it had been worse than either of them had said out loud. Victor Blackridge left Frost Hollow in the first week of December. He did not leave quietly, and nobody who knew him would have expected him to. He'd leased the empty storefront at the far end of the main street, the one that had been a hardware store before Dave Pullman had moved to the newer building. And by the second week of December, there were contractors in it, and by January it had been transformed into something that had clearly cost a significant amount of money to make look effortlessly welcoming. It was called Black Ridge Artisan on the sign outside, and tasteful lettering on reclaimed wood. The interior was the idealized version of what a bakery ought to look like, as designed by someone who'd studied photographs of bakeries rather than worked in one. The right chairs, the right lighting, the right arrangement of things in glass cases. The staff wore matching aprons in a particular shade of slate blue. The opening weekend drew a crowd, which was inevitable. Frost Hollow had 300 residents, and a new thing was a new thing, and people went the way people go to new things, out of curiosity, out of the social pull of everyone else going, out of the desire to have an opinion that was current. Evelyn heard the reports through the week. Ruth told her the croissants were flaky but had no real flavor to them. Hector Malm said the coffee was strong, which he meant as a compliment but described as the kind of strong that doesn't come with anything underneath it. Nora Sims came into Evelyn's bakery on the Tuesday after the opening, sat in her chair by the window, and said, without looking up from her book, "It's a very pretty room. I didn't feel anything in it." Evelyn did not say anything about Victor's bakery. When customers brought it up, and in the first 2 weeks nearly everyone did, because that was the rhythm of a small town, she said it was good to have options and changed the subject. She meant it, mostly. She didn't need him to fail for her to succeed. She just needed to keep doing what she'd always done, which was make something real for people who could tell the difference. What she hadn't fully anticipated was how quickly people could tell the difference. By February, the traffic at Black Ridge Artisan had thinned to something that looked sustainable from the outside, but that Evelyn, who understood the economics of this particular kind of business, recognized as a concern. The slate blue staff changed twice, different faces each time she walked past on her way to the supply depot. The glass cases started to have gaps in them by mid-morning that weren't being refilled. She didn't take satisfaction in this. She noticed it the way you notice weather, factually, without particular feeling about it. What she did take something from, something she didn't have a clean word for but that settled in her chest as a particular warmth, was the woman who came in on a Thursday in February and stood at the counter and said, "I grew up in a town like this, in Wyoming. There was a bakery like this one. I didn't know what I missed until I walked in here." She was maybe 45, a new resident, a teacher at the high school who'd transferred in that fall. She ordered the honey wheat and a cinnamon roll, and she sat at one of the mismatched chairs and ate slowly, and Evelyn, watching from behind the counter, understood in the clearest possible terms why none of it could have been franchised. You could not replicate the feeling of being somewhere real. You could build something that looked like it. People would go once or twice and recognize it as a very good copy, and then they would go somewhere else. Gideon started coming down every week instead of every 2 weeks. It happened without announcement. He just appeared on a Wednesday that wasn't his usual week. And then the following Wednesday, and after the third time, Evelyn realized the interval had changed and said nothing about it, because she was learning to let things develop at their own pace rather than naming them before they were ready to be named. He was useful in concrete ways she hadn't expected. He fixed the sign, not the old rotted one, but a new one, cut from a piece of cedar he'd shaped and sanded himself. The letters burned in rather than painted, Mercer's in a clean, simple script. He asked her before he put it up. She said yes. It went above the door on a Sunday in December, and when she came in Monday morning and saw it from the street, she stood looking at it for a longer moment than she'd expected to. He replaced 2 of the floor joists in the back kitchen that had been soft for 2 years, working on a Sunday when the bakery was closed, and he did it without saying anything about the condition they were in, which she appreciated because she already knew. He put new weather stripping on the door that faced the alley, and the draft she'd been compensating for every winter with an extra oven run disappeared. These were not romantic gestures in any conventional sense. They were the gestures of someone who paid attention to what was needed and then addressed it without requiring credit. She found, in the accumulation of them, something more substantial than conventional romance, the daily evidence of being genuinely seen. They had dinner twice in December, at the diner, which was the only sit-down option in Frost Hollow. The first time they were both slightly awkward in the way of people who'd been communicating in a shorthand for years and were now attempting full sentences. He ordered the same thing both times. She ordered differently and regretted the second choice, and he offered her half of his without commenting on her expression, which she found endearing in a way she didn't say out loud. By the third dinner in January, the awkwardness had largely worn away, replaced by the ease of two people who'd been paying attention to each other for years and had finally been given permission to admit it. "Can I ask you something?" she said, over the remains of the meal. "Yeah. Up on the mountain. What is it actually like?" "The winters." He considered the question with the seriousness he gave to most things. "Quiet," he said. "Cold in a way that town cold isn't. It gets into everything." He turned his coffee cup. "But you're busy enough that you don't—" He paused. "You don't have time to feel sorry for yourself, which I think was mostly the point. When you started going up." "Yeah." She looked at him. "Was there something you were getting away from, or something you were going toward?" "Both," he said. "For a long time I couldn't tell which. And now?" He met her eyes. "Now I'm mostly going toward." She looked at him across the table in the diner with its bad lighting and its laminated menus and its particular smell of coffee and pine cleaner, and she thought about all the ways a person reconstructs themselves after the thing that broke them. The different methods, the different shelters people build. His had been a mountain. Hers had been a bakery, been a mountain. Hers had been a bakery. Both of them had been doing the same work, in different terrain, and had ended up here. "I'm glad you kept coming down," she said. "Me too," he said. Victor Blackridge closed Blackridge Artisan in March. He didn't make a public announcement. The sign came down on a Tuesday. The contractors came back to remove the fixtures, and by Wednesday the storefront was empty again. The slate blue aprons were gone. The reclaimed wood lettering was gone. The town talked about it for a week, the way towns talk about things, and then other things happened, and it receded. What remained, after the talking died down, was a shift that Evelyn noticed in the way people came into her bakery. Clara Hitchens, who had been the primary voice for the Blackridge deal, came in one morning in March and sat down and said, without her usual careful approach to difficult things, "I owe you an apology." Evelyn looked at her. "I pushed you towards something that wasn't right for you, because I thought I knew better," Claire said. She was looking at the counter rather than at Evelyn, which meant this was costing her something. "I dressed it up as concern, and it was partly concern. I want to be clear about that. But it was also—" She stopped. "I had an idea of what would fix things for you, and my idea was mostly about what made sense to me, not to you." "Clara," Evelyn said. "I'm not finished." Clara looked up. "The thing with how you look. The thing Victor was saying about the marketing. I knew what he meant, and I didn't. I didn't push back on it. I should have." She held Evelyn's gaze with an effort that was visible. "You've been feeding this town for 6 years, and you are exactly what this place needs. And I should have said that instead of what I did say." The room was quiet. It was mid-morning, and there was only one other customer, a man from the new housing development who didn't know their history and was reading something on his phone and paying no attention. "Thank you," Evelyn said. She meant it fully. "Really. Thank you." It was not a complete accounting of everything that had accumulated over the years. The small cuts, the pauses before the word look, the long practice of being told she would be better if she were different. One apology didn't settle that. But Clara had come in on a Tuesday morning and said the hard thing without softening it beyond recognition, and that mattered. People were not capable of changing entirely, but they were capable of moments of genuine clarity, and those moments, when they came, were worth something. None. They married in June, Evelyn and Gideon, in a ceremony at the bakery because neither of them wanted to be anywhere else for it. It was not a large wedding. Frost Hollow in June had wildflowers along the creek beds, and the particular light that comes after a long winter, and Evelyn had baked everything herself the day before, which she'd insisted on and which Ruth had argued about and ultimately helped with, staying until 11 at night to frost the small tiered cake that sat on the counter beside the register. Gideon wore the only suit he owned, which fit him well enough except for the shoulders, which required the same slight angle he used for low doorways. And he stood at the front of the bakery with the expression of a man who was precisely where he meant to be. Nora Sims attended and sat in her chair by the window, which she'd claimed as her default position for 2 years, and said afterward that it was the best wedding she'd been to since 1974, which was the highest praise available from Nora, and everyone knew it. There was no grand speech. Evelyn said what she meant in short sentences because she'd learned that the truest things rarely needed elaboration. She said she believed in what she could see with her own eyes and touch with her own hands, and that 6 years of evidence was about as reliable as evidence got. She said she wasn't the easiest person to know, and he wasn't either, and she thought that was probably fine. Gideon said 3 sentences. He said she was the bravest person he knew. He said he was done being on the outside of things. He said he'd counted the money twice. Ruth laughed. Clara Hitchens cried, which surprised everyone, including Clara. Hector Malm, who had come because he came every morning and it hadn't occurred to him not to, stood at the back and looked at the ceiling briefly in the way men do when they're managing their faces. The room smelled like cinnamon and the particular warmth of the old oven, and outside the June light came through the windows and lay across the mismatched chairs, and the handwritten menu, and the cedar sign above the door, and the cracked glass case with its bead of clear silicone, and everything else that was imperfect and real and exactly as it was. The bakery did not transform into something unrecognizable after all of this. That would be the wrong ending, and it would also be a lie. What changed was smaller and more durable than transformation. Gideon built a proper prep table for the back kitchen, solid enough that it didn't shift when she put her weight into the dough, and he brought down timber from the mountain for it and shaped it himself, and she used it every morning. He learned which mornings were the hard ones, the days the oven ran wrong, the days the accounts didn't balance, the days the cold came in under the door and settled in her bones. And on those days he made the coffee and didn't require conversation. She learned that he was not easy to reach when something bothered him, that he went quiet in a way that looked like fine but wasn't, and that the correct approach was to leave the back door unlocked and the lamp on and wait, because eventually he would say the thing, but he had to come to it on his own schedule. She learned to wait. She had not always been patient. She was getting better at it. The town continued to be what it was. Small, opinionated, slow to change in some ways, and surprisingly quick in others. Clara Hitchens stopped making the gesture. It was not a dramatic cessation. She just stopped, the way habits stop when the thing underneath them shifts. Dave Pullman came in more often and stayed longer. The new teacher, the woman from Wyoming who'd sat with the honey wheat and the cinnamon roll, became a regular and eventually a kind of friend, the kind who knows when to ask and when to sit with you in comfortable silence. Nora Sims died in October, peacefully, at 72, in the chair by the window on a Tuesday afternoon. She'd been reading her library book. The library book had a bookmark in it at page 211. Evelyn kept the book. She would not have been able to explain why exactly, except that Nora had sat in that chair through all of it. The Blackridge offer, the community meeting, the money on the counter, all of it, and had watched with the steady, unsentimental attention of someone who'd lived long enough to know that most things worked themselves out, and the ones that didn't were worth witnessing anyway. She missed her. The sourdough starter was still on its shelf, fed every day, 11 years and counting from the 11 years Evelyn had kept it, from the 32 years her mother had kept it before that. 43 years of the same culture, tended by 2 women in the same back kitchen, one of them gone now, and one of them still here, still coming in at 4 in the morning, still doing the early work by oven glow and the light of the single lamp. What Evelyn understood now, in the particular way you understand things only after you've lived through the version that could have gone differently, was this. The people who tell you to change yourself have, almost without exception, already decided what they want you to become. Their vision of your improvement is a version of you that suits them better. It is dressed as care. It arrives as concern. It uses the language of your own best interests. And it is, underneath all of that, a request that you make yourself smaller, quieter, easier, less. The world will always have people like that in it. Clara Hitchens was not a villain. Victor Blackridge was not a monster. They were ordinary people operating from ordinary assumptions about what a woman like Evelyn was worth and what she might become with the right adjustments. The cruelty was not dramatic. It was daily and incremental and came wrapped in good intentions, and that was the kind that cost the most because it was the hardest to name. What Gideon had given her, and she was careful about this, careful not to let the story become one where a man's love repaired a woman who needed repairing, was not rescue. She had not been waiting to be rescued. She had been running a bakery for 6 years with her hands in the dough at 4 in the morning and feeding a town that occasionally forgot to feed her back. What he had given her was witness. The specific and irreplaceable experience of being seen clearly, accurately, over a long period of time by someone who had no interest in the improved version. Not despite her, that framing was its own diminishment, the one that required you to overcome yourself in order to be loved. Simply her, the whole shape of her. As she was. She thought sometimes about the woman she might have become if she'd signed Victor's contract. The reduced version. Smaller in the literal sense and smaller in every other one. Professionally successful, probably. Financially secure. And somehow further from herself than she'd been at the worst of the Dale years, because at least then she'd known something was being taken. The contract would have made it voluntary. She was glad she'd been stubborn. She was glad she'd been tired enough and scared enough and just brave enough to say no at the exact moment it mattered. She was glad he'd counted the money twice. On a Wednesday morning in November, 1 year to the month from when all of it had started, Evelyn opened the bakery at 6:30. The first snow of the season had come overnight, an inch on the windowsill, the world muffled in white and early. Gideon was already in the back kitchen. He'd been there since 4. She'd woken to find his side of the bed empty and the faint smell of coffee in the house. And she'd known without asking that he'd gone down early to help with the heavy lifting before she got in. He was not a man who announced these things. He just did them. She came through the back door, and he was at the new prep table with the morning's second batch of dough, his large hands working it in the way she'd shown him, which was close to right and still slightly off, which she'd stopped correcting because the slightly off quality was his, and it was real. "First snow," she said. "Yeah." He didn't look up. "Cold coming." "So I hear." She tied her apron and turned on the lamp above the work table and checked the sourdough starter in its ceramic crock, fed it, set it back on its shelf. She turned on the oven. She took down the recipe cards in her mother's handwriting, browned at the edges, the ink still clear. She did what she always did. She began. Outside, Frost Hollow was waking up under its first snow, the way it did every year, the way it would go on doing. In a few hours, the door would open and the people would come. Hector Malm for his rye, the Dawson kids before school, the woman from Wyoming who would sit and eat slowly and feel something she didn't have a word for, which was simply the feeling of being somewhere that had been built by someone who meant it. And in the back kitchen, 2 imperfect people who had found each other by the slow accumulation of small true things stood at a work table in the early dark and made something worth making, and the morning came in around them, and it was enough. It was, in the way that real things are, more than enough.